Yo, this is Will from JangaFX. Over the past couple months, I have been experimenting with Blender and EmberGen in order to present a comprehensive look at utilizing EmberGen in your animations. The point of this video is to get EmberGen users comfortable with preparing imported meshes to use in EmberGen. I'm going to specifically focus on the Blender EmberGen pipeline, but I'll also have general tips for all EmberGen users, regardless of your initial 3D software. I'll be rebuilding this scene from scratch to show everything from start to finish, and I'll include the EmberGen file and links to the resources that I use in the description below. We'll be using Blender 4.0 and EmberGen 1.1 in this video, so make sure that you are at least updated to those versions before we continue. So without further ado, let's get to it. So in our new EmberGen scene, we will start by utilizing everyone's favorite tutorial resource, Mixamo. I will be using the MMA Roundhouse kick animation. I set the overdrive to 45, and I will be downloading this at 30 frames per second. Once we download that, we can clear everything out of our scene and import at FBX. I found out that Blender changes the FPS value of your scene based on the FPS of the latest imported FBX file. Not super important, but something to keep in mind. But the first thing that we are going to do is apply Vertex Paint to this mesh. The proper way to do this is to select your mesh and go into the Data Properties, and under Color Attributes, hit the plus button and then click OK. By default, the color is black, and that's exactly what we are looking for. Once I hit Apply, we can hop into the Vertex Paint mode, and you can see that our mesh is now completely black. So what I'm going to do is select red, and I'm going to paint that onto the foot that is going to be kicking, get a little bit of the calf as well. You can also vertex paint in the sculpt mode. If you scroll down and find the paintbrush, select your color, and I'll select green for these purposes. You won't see the vertex paint until you start painting, but then once you do, you'll be returned right back to the same color painting view. One thing to note is that animated vertex paint is not supported in EmberGen at the moment. I'll show you a way that you can kind of get around this, but that'll be once we hop into the EmberGen section of this video. Now that we have our character painted, I'm going to create some geometry around the character so that we can have some lighting and shadows to compare with our Blender render. But now that I've made all of these, I'm going to select them and hit Control A and apply all transforms. Specifically, the scale is something that you want to apply your transforms to. Otherwise, when you export it as an FBX file, you might get unexpected results. And next up, we are going to create a camera. So I'm going to hit Shift A, create a camera, and with Control Alt 0, I'm going to put the camera where the viewport window is. And I will pull out my camera to viewport and just position this camera where I'm going to want it. Let's change the focal length of the camera to be a little bit wider so that I can zoom in, frame it how, I think that looks good. And we should also go into the timeline and enter, I believe 54 is the last frame. I can check that by clicking on the skeleton, and yeah, 54. Now that I have the camera where I want, I'm going into the item properties. I'm going to hit I on the rotation transforms, and in the graph editor, I'm going to put the timeline to 1, and then in the X Euler rotation, I'm going to add a noise modifier to add a little bit of camera movement with the strength at 0.015, just some light movement. And then what I can do is copy this F-curve modifier, go to Z, then paste that F-curve, and I'm just going to change the phase and the offset a little bit so that they're not doing the exact same thing. So now we have just a little bit of shaky cam just to demonstrate a little bit of camera movement in Blender. It's important to note that if you're using a vertical camera for your animation, you need to go into the sensor fit and change this to vertical. Now you're going to see that if I click that, it is actually changing the composition within the frame of the camera, but you can adjust the focal length to get it back to where you want it. Also, there is no motion blur or camera depth in EmberGen at this time, so you won't see either of those reflected in EmberGen. Let's set the sensor fit back to auto. Auto just defaults to horizontal, so that's why I'm keeping it that way. But now that we have our scene completed, it's time to export this animation. And I will be exporting this as an FBX file. I'm using FBX because it seems to be more stable than Alembic files. But if you see any inconsistencies between the two, please reach out to us, to our support email, and we'll be happy to look into any issues that you come across. It's also important to note that regardless of your software, EmberGen will not cooperate with imported meshes that have variable vertex counts, which will come up in simulations and stuff like that. You'll need to make sure that your mesh doesn't have any of that happening. The main focus for our export settings is to disable NLA strips and all actions. This will have Blender take all of the animation data and bake it into one channel instead of all of them existing in their own separate channels. Limiting to selected objects can be good, but if you use this, make sure that you are selecting the entire hierarchy of any skeletal meshes, otherwise they won't be imported or exported properly. We have also seen some weird behaviors with imported meshes into EmberGen, specifically rig models that are coming from Maya. Typically, if you can import it into Blender and then just re-export that file, it should work in EmberGen. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where the issues are coming from, but if you ever experience something like this, please let us know and include those files so that we can look into how to better import different types of file structures. But what I'm going to do is export this out, and I will meet you in EmberGen. I've included the EmberGen file in the description below, so I'm not going to take the time to go over the method of how exactly I created this EmberGen file, but I'll talk about the specifics that relate to imported meshes. What I'm going to do first is duplicate one of these import nodes so that I'm keeping the transform controls that I customized for this preset. But after I do that, I can delete those two and then open up the EmberGen file that we exported. Cool, so now that we have that here, we are going to go into retiming. When you're using an animated mesh inside of EmberGen, make sure you always enable override FPS. The formula for one-to-one frame matching in EmberGen is that your FPS value multiplied by your frame stride needs to equal your time step. This is the formula. Follow that and all will be well. By default, your time step is set to 60 and your frame stride is set to 1. So typically, when you import a mesh, regardless of its initial FPS value, you'll want to keep that at 60 to match 1-to-1. So yeah, if you follow this, it will work. In this file, my original FPS is 30, but because I have my time step set to 80, I have my FPS value set to 40, and my frame stride at 2, just to hammer down that equation again. This is also good to keep in mind because these adjustments might be necessary depending on your specific use case. EmberGen doesn't perform very well with fast-moving objects, so you may need to slow down the playback of that mesh in the FPS value, but of course you'll need to then make up for that in the frame stride and or time step based off of the adjustments that you make. And as a word of caution, as you venture further away from the default time step of 60 Hertz, you'll start to get less predictable results, and you may need to adjust various force or simulation parameters more than you usually would. As I was fine-tuning this EmberGen file, I was going back and forth between these settings to try to find the right balance between them. You can see that I have keyframes in the timeline, and as I adjust the time step value, it doesn't scale the keyframes with that. So what I need to do is select my keyframes, and you can see that if I hover over the keyframes, we have some keyboard shortcuts to use. And the one that I was using is Shift-Alt-Click, and I'm able to scale my keyframes across the timeline so that they better match the orientation that they had when I previously set them. You can also see that my mesh is rotated a bit, and that is because I have positioned the mesh to maximize the number of active voxels in the bounding box. Since the bounding box can't be repositioned, you'll have to reposition and scale your mesh so that you can maximize that area. With the Roundhouse kick, it is not really advantageous to have a diagonal arcing motion of voxels just because you leave so much empty space. So depending on your scene, you may need to do similar adjustments so that you can maximize your computer resources. One thing that I will not be using is the geometry pin of the import node. That is because if you're using the geometry pin, you are using all of the mesh data in the animation to drive either your collisions or emission, whatever that parameter is connected to. So I will be using the mask section here. So the mask 2 section is where I have my collision data. So what I've done is I've gone into the bones and I've selected all of the bones, and then I typed in foot and deselected the right foot so that I can have the whole body act as a collision and affect the vorticity of the simulation, except for the right foot. Let's go ahead and connect that to the collider shapes. Mask 3 is where we will utilize the red vertex color. So I'm going to connect that to the fire kick, and mask 3 I'm going to enable the vertex color red and increase the reference value a little bit. It'll take a little bit for it to spark up. You can see that only the foot is now emitting, and we have our little shape here, which I will describe shortly. Now, I previously said that EmberGen doesn't support animated vertex paint, but this is where you can get around that limitation. What I've done is I've gone into Blender and I have painted gradients of red, starting from the strength of close to 1, falling off to almost 0. What you can do is you can keyframe the reference value in EmberGen, and that will kind of simulate the spreading of fire. So I'll just play this file here, and you can see that as I lower this, that the fire is spreading from the right side of the plane to the left. And that's because the reference value is telling it everything that is above this value include in the emission from the vertex color. So you can see as I increase it again, it goes back. So you will need to paint your mesh accordingly. This means that the vertex paint will need to be at its highest strength at the starting point and its lowest strength at the end point, if that makes sense. The rendering tab of your import node is also impacted by the mask selection. So what I'm doing is, instead of using render all, which will include all of our geometry and kind of block my view, I am using mask 4 just as a render mask, and I have selected the alpha joints and alpha surface for our mesh. And so that's the only thing that I'm seeing while I work on this project. So I'll delete this primitive here, and I'll demonstrate again that even though we have emission coming from the foot, it's the speed of the mesh is still too much for EmberGen to get a good amount of fuel emission from it. The feature that significantly improves this is the import control in primitive shapes. You can see that I have the right foot of my mesh on the import node, and this is coming from the control panel. And you can see that if I search foot, I have this enabled, and this allows me to drive the transform controls of this primitive mesh to whatever I connect it to. Now, if I replay this, I'm able to emit from the sphere, which allows me to give so much more fuel and temperature and all of that good stuff. And it really is a powerful, game-changing tool in EmberGen 1.1. Thank your local developers. Before we get into exporting, I do want to say that in general, it is good to experiment with the voxel count or the size of your bounding box and how that impacts your machine. Since I know that I'm going to be using upscaling before I export, I want to control my bounds so that when I am using that upscaling, that either 3x or 4x isn't going to push my simulation over 1 billion voxels. That's when my graphics card is going to start not behaving as fast as it could if it was below that threshold. And if I want to preview this in a higher res, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new render node connected to the camera that I want, and I'm going to set the first frame as the frame that I want to analyze. So right now we're at frame 57. So I would set this to 57 and the number of frames to 1. And that allows me to export only one frame, not have to wait for the entire thing. And then if I were to hop back into the scene node, I can make adjustments to the volume post-processing or the shader node and preview those changes in real time. I won't be able to change simulation settings like vorticity or fuel emission, obviously, but it's a way to, if I'm happy with the large bulk of the simulation, it allows me to observe these changes that I'm making on the shading level without having to re-simulate, a 3 upscaled simulation. And then when I'm happy with what I've done, I'll go back to the simulation node and change upscaling to 0 and continue working if I need to. Right now, I think we are happy with our simulation results. So we're going to set up our export and render nodes. One thing that I haven't done yet is connect the camera to the camera node. Your FBX will include all cameras that you included in your scene, which is nice. We only have one, so I will take this and connect it to the camera control. I will need to go into that camera and change the display resolution. It just needs to be the same aspect ratio of the render. So if you're rendering in 4K, you can still have your camera be in 720p. And let's delete this render node. Here I was experimenting with different capture types, but the only ones that we are going to need for this are the render all and alpha channel. I do want to point out that when you usually add a capture type that is a single channel like the alpha or smoke mask, that it will default to a single channel output. If you want the output to be in grayscale, you can just connect that channel to the RGB and that will export it as like from black to white essentially. And we will be utilizing both the image sequence and the VDB sequence. So since I've made transform changes to the import node, what I need to do is take the transform pin of the import node and connect that to the VDB. This will invert all of those changes that we made to the VDB so that when you import that VDB, it should be exactly where it is relative to the mesh that we used in EmberGen. At this point, whatever your workflow is for your project, you can move forward with that. I've hopefully covered what you would need to properly utilize an imported mesh inside of EmberGen. If you want to stick around for the super cool Blender rendering trick, that's coming up next. Now, I could select both of these nodes and export them together with this button or Shift-Control-E, but I'm going to use the upscaling for the image sequence, and I'm going to use no upscaling for the VDB sequence. Once that's done, I will meet you back in Blender. Now that we are back in our Blender file, we can import the VDB that we just exported. Typically, at this point, we would apply a volumetric material to this VDB and use it as the final asset for our animation. The problem with this is that it, 1, takes so much longer to render, 2, doesn't produce as good of lighting in our scene, and 3, doesn't look as good as it did in EmberGen. And this is where I hope that I've unlocked all of these constraints, at least for use cases like this one. So let's put our VDB in a new collection. So I'll select scene, do this, add VDB. We're just going to throw this in here, and we are going to disable that. Next, I will use Shift A to add a plane, and in the modifier section, I will add, or I'll search for the volume to mesh modifier, and I will select, actually let's enable the VDB so that I can select it. Now I can disable that, and we're still good. We can play with the threshold and adaptivity. So right now I think the threshold is too small. I think I'm gonna go 0.02. Yeah, I think that looks better. Adaptivity is good. You can see that the vertices and edges decrease. When we're at this threshold, it's not as big of a deal, but I will enable smooth shading, and then I will add another modifier, a geometry nodes modifier. And in the geometry node editor, I will add a set material node. And if we go to the shader editor, switch back to object, I will create a new material, and with our node wrangler add-on enabled, I will hit Control-T, and this will add the image texture, mapping, and texture coordinate nodes. In the image texture node, I'll go into the PNG export and open that sequence. Make sure we're on auto refresh. And then typically, when I was at this point, I was using the window coordinates for the vector. And you can see that if I go to the material view, I am now using this render window to project the exported image sequence onto this mesh whenever it decides to load. Because I probably didn't set the material in the geometry node editor. I didn't. There we go. Now we see it. But if I leave the camera, so I'll take this off. If I leave the camera, you see that it's staying with the camera as I move through the viewport. And in order to map this to the geometry permanently, I can add the UV project modifier. We will add a UV map, and I will take the camera, and then for the scale X or Y, you just need to divide 16 by 9 or 9 by 16 to get your value. And I think if I do Y, 0.562 is the value I need. So if I go back into the camera, I will go into the shader editor, and now I can use the UV from the camera. And now when I leave the camera, we can see that it's being projected onto the mesh for the whole time. And I will also need to open the emission tab and add the color to that color, and the strength I will put at 1.5. So now we have an emissive material in our mesh. Also at this point, I went into the material settings, and in emission sampling, I did front and back with transparent shadows enabled. So now if I go to the viewport shading, we can see that we have our mesh emitting light for our full scene. Now, by default, I have an HDRI background from my Blender projects, but what I'm gonna do is hit the X here and create a new world background and set that strength to 0.1 so that we can get a little bit of ambient light, but primarily be driven by the EmberGen simulation. I'll go back to the viewport shading, and in the object properties for our VDB to mesh plane, I will go into the visibility settings and turn off camera visibility. We'll still be able to see it if we're cycling between these two viewports, but now the mesh is invisible in the viewport shading view. We now have a mesh that is emitting light exactly where the simulation should be, and the light that is cast is better than the VDB, and it renders faster than the VDB. But we can also add a point light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift right click onto the mesh, and you can see that it moves my 3D cursor here, and I'm going to add a point light to this area. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just generally follow the emission pattern here and apply transform controls to that point light that generally follow that. So I will do that right now. And new to EmberGen 4.0 is now we can use image textures for the emission color of the point light. In previous versions of Blender, you had to use a rectangle light if you wanted your image texture to drive the color output of that light, which introduced a lot of challenges in trying to recreate a scene like this, because you'd have to overlap the lights and you'd either have a hard shadow or a light intersecting, and it was just difficult to work with. But now I can just use the same Control-T shortcut and load in our PNG sequence to the point light. Just refresh this, and you need to have the normal texture coordinates into your vector, and I will enable auto refresh. Now if we disable our plane, you can see that our point light is, well, it's not projecting properly yet, and that's because we need to change the radius to, I think between 0.1 and 0.2 was giving me the results that I was looking for. But let's increase this strength to about 25. Now you can see that this light is contributing to the scene. It's not doing a whole lot, and that is on purpose. The majority of the light is coming from the plane, or the volume to mesh that we added, and this point light is just allowing Blender to calculate the light of the scene much faster than it would without it. So let's re-enable this, and let's increase the power output to say 15 watts. One thing that can be helpful as well is adding a hue saturation value node right after your image texture. So let's disconnect those. Here we'll replug these in, and this will just give you more fine control over the color space of your light and mesh. The last step of this is something that I would typically do in another software, but because Blender allows us to do this, I'm going to add the image sequences from EmberGen and composite them in the export. All right, now that I have my compositor node set up, I'm going to render both of these projects and come back with the render times and the difference between them. So I am recording this after doing some additional testing for the export. My first results weren't in line with my expectations, so I did another round of troubleshooting to try to isolate the issue. I was comparing render times while adjusting the sample rate, light clamping, and the strength values of the two emission sources. What I found was that at lower resolution, the results are less strong, but as you increase the samples or compare to a larger VDB, which would likely be used, I was finding even stronger results than my initial testing, some as high as a 300% decrease in render times from using a VDB to this new method. So what I can say is that this will be my preferred way of rendering volumetrics in Blender, but I would love to hear if this helps out your projects in the future and which settings work best for you. Let us know in the comments if you have any questions, and until next time, bye for now.